Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Interview with a Life Coach podcast series. We are continuing our discussion around attachment styles, and today we are going to talk a little bit about anxious attachment. So, what does it mean when someone has an anxious attachment style? If you have an anxious attachment style, you might be more likely to seek attention or validation from other people. So then what causes a person to develop an anxious attachment style? Most often this develops in people when they are adolescents, right? When they are children and they have a parent or a caregiver who is hypercritical or affectionately dismissive. So most of us know what it's like to be in a relationship with someone who's hypercritical. If you're in a relationship with someone where everything you do seems to be wrong, or nothing you do is good enough. And so as a result, we end up internalizing the other person's perception of ourselves and treating ourselves the same way that we've been treated because we think that that's normal or that's what we deserve. So then when you look at having a caregiver or being in a relationship with a person who is affectionately dismissive, what does that look like? Like if you're a child and you go to give your parent a hug and they say, "What's wrong with you?" or "Go away," or they might say, "What do you want?" Then you start to learn that in order for you to receive affection, you must want something, or if someone tries to show you affection, that they want something. And then eventually you stop seeking out affection from other people, or you avoid expressing a need. If you're that same parent, if you're upset or you're sad about something and you try to communicate that to them, they shut you down, or they're condescending over the fact that you have emotional needs. You develop an anxious attachment style to the point where you're in constant need of someone else's attention or validation. So then you grow up to be an adult who is constantly seeking attention or validation from other people because you didn't get it in your childhood. You were taught that you're not good enough. So subconsciously you still feel like you're not good enough on some level. So how does this, we're going to talk a little bit about how to heal anxious attachment styles in a minute. I also wanted to touch briefly on what anxious attachment might look like in the workplace, and then what anxious attachment might look like in a personal relationship. So if we're looking at anxious attachment in the workplace, what does that look like? It might look like you're constantly overanalyzing and overthinking and assuming the worst. So if you have a review coming up, you're assuming it's not going to go well. If someone is talking with another colleague in the kitchen or in the next room and you happen to come in the room and the talking stops, you automatically assume that it's about you, because again, that whole mindset, right, that your whole perspective revolves around whatever is going on. It all comes back to me, right? So if people aren't happy, it's my fault. If I'm happy, I'm looking for an opportunity, I'm anticipating for that to go sideways and to be blamed for something. Everything that I do is not good enough in some way. Like I'm going to be failing someone in some way, and everybody knows this. It's only a matter of time. So how do you begin to shift that perspective? So then when we're looking at relationships and we're looking at an anxious person in a relationship, constantly needing approval or validation from their partner, what does that look like? So maybe your partner's out, or they're away from home, or they're at work, and you send them a text message and they don't text you back right away. Then your subconscious mind automatically goes back to that same classical conditioning of, I have an emotional need to talk to my partner. They're not talking to me. What's wrong? Something must be wrong with me, right? Instead of recognizing, oh, well, maybe they're in a work meeting, or maybe they're driving on the road and they saw my text message, they just haven't had time to respond yet. It's internalized. So triggers for a person who has an anxious attachment style might include conflict around interpersonal situations. And this is primarily because they're accustomed to, when they are in an interpersonal conflict, their emotions, their feelings aren't being heard. They aren't being understood, right? So as a result of that, occasionally the anxious attached person will go out of their way to overexpress their emotions or exaggerate to let the person on the other side of that conversation know how they're feeling, because they're anticipating that they're not going to be understood. So they think, oh, well, let me go above and beyond to make sure that my feelings are being heard. Because if you think about that, if you're as a child and you go to hug your parent, you're thinking, oh, I haven't seen mom all day. Let me tell her hello and I love you and give her a hug. And if that's met with, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Or the parent pushing the child away, that's where that feeling of not being understood, the desire to maybe over-explain yourself or try harder to get the other person to see where you're coming from, can come through when you're exaggerating your feelings, right? When you're exaggerating the circumstance. It's like it's overcompensating for not feeling like they're being heard. So how do you navigate a relationship with an anxiously attached person? The first thing that we want to do is make sure that the other person's feeling heard, right? We want to maybe stop what you're doing if you can and take the time to listen and be fully engaged with the other person, because that's where some of the trigger comes from, is feeling like they're not being understood, like they're not being heard. And no one has shown them that, or they have had limited or experience with other people showing them or creating a safe space for them to express their feelings. So if you can provide that safe space by slowing down, stopping, looking at them, and listening. Something else you can do if you're in a relationship with someone who has an anxious attachment style is making sure that you're, in addition to active listening, is to make sure that you aren't judging them, right? Maybe we're not telling them that how they're feeling isn't valid, because that's someone else's opinion, right? They feel how they feel. You want to make sure that you're fully present and being a sounding board for how they feel, right? That you're actively listening. And then we also want to make sure that we're setting up boundaries, because just because someone has an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style doesn't mean that we still shouldn't have boundaries around healthy communication in the relationship, right? Just because we have a disagreement, it doesn't mean that it's okay to yell or curse or throw things. We should be able to speak to each other in a respectful, calm fashion where both parties are being heard and both parties feel understood. Back to the example that we gave before of a child trying to hug their parent and the parent saying, "Why are you doing that? What's wrong with you?" So then I learned that when I'm expressing my feelings, or when I'm trying to express myself, I am often misunderstood, and it's generally not safe. And so even when I'm retelling a story about or I'm reiterating what happened, right, in a certain scenario, and I'm trying to get someone else to understand where I'm coming from and to understand how I'm feeling, I'm going to have a natural tendency to admit the areas of that scenario that would make it look like what happened was my fault. Because internally, I don't have any room for that, right? I already feel like everything's my fault, and I don't want the other person to blame me for the conflict that we're having. It's not really, I don't want them to think that I caused this problem. I just want them to understand how I felt. So I'm exaggerating the situation because I want to make sure that my feelings are being heard, and then I'm omitting some of the areas where I might have done something wrong in that situation, because I feel like that's what's going to be heard on a loudspeaker instead of my feelings. Any missteps that I have, that's what's going to be seen instead of my true intention. And then I was having a conversation around this with my husband the other day, and I was looking at my relationship with myself, and then thinking about the relationships that some of the conversations that I've had with other coaches, and how to heal an anxious attachment style. And we came back to the conversation of confronting your inner child, right? Of first accepting the fact that you have an anxious attachment style, understanding what that is, and then maybe going to a counselor or a therapist, someone that you trust, to help you kind of unpack where that stems from if you don't already know, and then to like reimagine yourself in that situation and talk to that inner child and to say, hey, this happened to you and that wasn't okay, right? Or you wanting to give your parent a hug is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And the way that they reacted to you might not have been right. It might not have been fair. That it wasn't okay for them to dismiss your feelings. And that it's safe for you to now have healthy relationships with people. It's safe for you to expect that when you have an emotional need, that it can be met with understanding. That there are ways for you to communicate effectively when you're in a relationship with a healthy partner, with healthy friends, and it can be received well. One of the most challenging things I think about, when it comes to developing unhealthy attachment styles, is the fact that they begin when we're so young, that they often begin when we're so young, and in a position where we have to, kind of accept or tolerate certain behavior, in a sense, because there's nowhere else we can go, right? If you're 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, maybe 15, 16 years old, and you have a parent or caregiver who is hostile or condescending, controlling, or affectionately dismissive, there's only so much that you can do. To a certain extent, you have to accept or tolerate that behavior. And the problem with that is that you start to internalize it. So even when that person isn't there, we've created these habits in our mind, right? Like if you've ever heard of, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Dr. Joe Dispenza, and basically that neurons that fire together, wire together. So that's what happens when you're accustomed to experiencing certain feelings, or when situations trigger certain feelings in your adolescence. Your brain starts to anticipate feelings when you're in a certain situation. So it's just that neurons that fire together, wire together, and so you're looking at rewiring your brain, right, and remapping your brain. But first you have to know where the kink is, right? Where the disconnect is, why something isn't making the connection that it should be making. So you want to take a look at where some of those issues started, and to avoid that from being overly traumatic for you, in order to do that in a productive, proactive way, sometimes it's great to have help. And I'm still a huge proponent for a great therapist for that. I've linked Psychology Today below, if you guys want to check that out as well. But yeah, and then I also wanted to make sure to talk with you guys about some scriptures that can help you if you're dealing with an anxious attachment style, or if you have a partner or a loved one who also has an anxious attachment style. So the first verse comes from Philippians 4, verses 6 through 7, and it reads, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And the second verse comes from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. It reads, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but it gives us power, love, and self-discipline." So sometimes we feel like, our attachment style, whether it's an avoidant attachment style or an anxious attachment style, that it's keeping us safe. But when we lean not on our own understanding, in all our ways we acknowledge Christ, we come to recognize that there is strength in surrender. That we don't have to be a prisoner of our anxious thoughts. We don't have to be a prisoner of overthinking. Yeah. That when you let Christ lead your life, you can have peace in that. That you are worthy, right? That Christ died to make us worthy. That if Christ says you're worthy, you don't need any validation from anyone else. You don't need approval from anyone else. So basically, whatever you're worried about, God has it taken care of. You don't have to do that anymore. That version of you that used to accept and tolerate being in a relationship with someone who was not a stable individual, being in a toxic relationship with someone that caused you to have an anxious attachment style, no longer has to be acceptable to you. That being anxious, that being stressed out, that being worried all the time is not a part of the plan God has for your life. If you enjoyed today's content, please don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe. And then also if you would like to hear more about attachment styles, I am going to be hosting an event with another coach, and I would love to see you guys there. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about attachment styles in relationships and have a bit of a Q&A if that's something you're interested in as well. It is free to attend the class, so yeah, you can just click the link below and sign up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye guys. So this is a weird filter thing that's happening right now, but I did want to leave you guys with one more note before I leave, and that's this morning I got up for work and I was in a bad mood. I had overslept and I was so cranky, and I had noticed like my words were not positive. I was yelling because I was worried that I was going to be late, and I had to have a come to Jesus moment with myself and say, wait a minute, why am I showing up this way? And it all came back to fear, right? I was worried about being late for work and what other people would think, and so it came back to me living my life on autopilot, and not wanting even to text my supervisor because it's like for a courier business that I was running late because I wanted to avoid that confrontation. And my husband's like, no, just message him, it's not going to be a big deal. And I had to do that. But to remind you guys, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of a sound mind. So to keep that in perspective, when you're feeling anxious, when your attachment style is causing you to feel anxious, when you're feeling avoidant, like you want to run away or like you need to take control of the situation, to remember that God has not given us the spirit of fear. And if you surrender that fear to God, He will make your path straight and give you peace. I love you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye guys.